Hey everyone, it's Jay Calderon with 12rounder.com. Here giving you the aftermath to Tony Bellew versus Nathan Cleverly 2, the rematch, the grudge match. Took place at the Echo Arena in Liverpool. On paper, at least, it seemed like it could be a fairly fun and exciting broadcast. It was a pay-per-view broadcast on the other side of the pond there. In the end, it didn't really totally live up to that, if we're all being truthful. I mean, you could look at Scott Quigg's title defense, Jamie McDonald's title defense, or Callum Smith's step up against Nicolas Shekloka, and you could look at all those fights, even the Bradley Saunders fight, which I would believe is his debut for Matchroom, and they were all sort of just fights that occurred. There wasn't really anything. The only thing that you could say about those fights is that they happened. There wasn't anything all that particularly exciting about them. Those fighters that I mentioned, of course, with the exception of Shekloka, won their fights, but no more really needs to be said about those fights. I'm sure they'll be in bigger, more important, perhaps more impressive performances in the fights to come. And anyway, in any event, rather, we can get to James DeGale's, absolute blitzing of Marco Antonio Paraben. He came out, seemed a little wild with the left hand, but at the end of the day, he was up against a guy who seemed ill-prepared, and he had too much speed on his side, and he had more confidence in his power, perhaps since the Brandon Gonzalez win, just maybe feeling healthy now at this point, whatever the case may be. He kept rolling, stopped him in the third round. The guy had never been stopped. He'd been in there with a couple of decent fighters. He wasn't a, top 10 guy, probably a top 15 guy, top 20 guy maybe in the division, but in the end, he did what he was supposed to do, what you would expect a guy who used to be a highly touted prospect, who's now a well-deserved called, he's called now in a well-deserved fashion, I should say, a top-flight contender, and he performed the way you would expect and want a top-flight contender to perform. The same, on the other hand, in sort of a coincidental manner, cannot be said for George Groves, a guy who beat DeGale a few years back. Groves looked sluggish against a guy named Dennis Douglin. Douglin was a little faster than maybe people would have expected. He was a southpaw. That combination alone with a decent jab can give people some trouble, but you would expect nonetheless a guy like Groves, who was significantly bigger. You could see it in the ring. You would expect a guy like Groves to not be necessarily caught with every single punch that Douglin seemed to be throwing in the first 2 or 3 rounds. You'd expect him to have a smoother go of trying to change his own tactics and going for feints and drawing in counter opportunities, as opposed to just continuing to get hit until he finally just started to wear down a smaller guy who was probably made to fold in this case anyway. It wasn't the greatest performance, but it was mentioned during the broadcast that maybe he needs a bit of a rest, and that might make sense. He's had a very busy schedule with a lot of big fights, a lot of emotionally high fights, a lot of physically taxing fights. It might make sense to just sit down certainly for the remainder of this year, of course, and maybe into the summer of next year. Just get a good half year off. Let your body relax. Stay in shape, but let yourself catch up to what you are trying to do in this sport. Because at this point, it feels like he's still winning the race to an extent, but it feels like he's stumbling. So he needs to perhaps maybe take it back a few notches there. Anthony Joshua, the highly touted heavyweight prospect, went to 10-0 with 10 knockouts, knocking out Michael Sprott in less than 2 full minutes of action. Very impressive performance considering the circumstances. Doesn't mean he's necessarily going to be the world beater that some are predicting, but he did what you expect him to do. Now, with Kevin Johnson potentially taking place early next year, we might start to get a sense of what he can really become. But for the most part, A+ for the first 10 opponents. Overall, he did exactly what he was supposed to do, how he was supposed to do it, built himself up a nice buzz in the process. Then comes time for the main event, and it was Tony Bellew seeking and attaining revenge against arch-rival Nathan Cleverly. It was one of those fights, obviously, that started off a bit timid, understandable. Both guys don't want to make that mistake against this guy, and it was in a new division, and a lot was on the line. Cleverly started out jabbing very well. He was moving very well, but around the 7th, 8th round, Bellew's just constant pressure, the fact that he's the bigger man naturally, and the fact that he was attacking the body started to take its toll on Cleverly, who wasn't throwing much of the right hand, who seemed like a guy who, there was speculation that he hurt his hand. I don't really think he did hurt his right hand. I think, to me, that felt more like the performance of a guy who didn't want to throw that right hand because he knew it left him open for big shots in return that he had not yet taken at cruiserweight. suffice to say, he actually took them quite well, considering Bellew landed a pretty good assortment of shots for the last 4 rounds, and he didn't fall. He dipped a few times, he got stunned, wobbled, whatever you want to call it, a few times, but he did overcome that adversity and at least made it to the final bell. Split decision didn't make any sense to me. Virtually everyone you saw had it at least relatively close after 8 rounds, and those final 4 rounds, there's just no way you could give a single one of them to Cleverly. So from that point, you have to then, in order to give Cleverly the victory here, you have to find, after losing 4 rounds clearly, you have to find out of the remaining 8 rounds the ability to give him, at the very least, of course, here, 7 out of those initial 8. Considering the sort of fight it was, that's a bit difficult to do. Sorry, it just doesn't seem very likely to me. So he clearly lost that fight, and thankfully the right guy got it in the split decision fashion, and, you know, it's difficult to say what's going to happen next for Cleverly, obviously. Cruiserweight might not necessarily be his weight. And for Bellew, you know, Marco Huck's potentially out there. Some other big fights could potentially be on the horizon. He's certainly a draw in Liverpool, so he always has those sort of options. But that pretty much sums it up. Tell me what you thought of their performances, what you thought of the night overall, whether or not you thought in the end this deserved to be pay-per-view. Tell me all your thoughts, all your everything you noticed about the fight, and you know, you can ask your own questions. I'll do my best to answer them from my perspective. In any event, love to hear from you. Hit me up on Twitter at 12RounderBoxing. Hit me up in the comment section below. Of course, subscribe, like, share, all that great stuff. Love you guys and your support, and until next time, enjoy the fights.